Welcome to our study of St. Paul's letter to the First and Second Corinthians. Today, we'd like to present an introduction to the two letters. If there was a church that caused Paul to pull his hair out and made him age before his time, it was probably the church of Corinth. The city of Corinth was the capital of the Roman province of Achaia, or southern Greece. It sat at the foot of a rugged limestone mountain, 1,886 feet high. Corinth had been destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC, but was rebuilt by Emperor Julius Caesar in 44 BC. It grew quickly and soon recaptured its former prominence. In Paul's day, Corinth had a population of about 80,000, with a further 20,000 in surrounding villages and settlements. Part of the reason for Corinth's success was its strategic location on the isthmus, or narrow strip of land with sea on either side, between the two halves of Greece. So the green line indicates Paul's beginning of his third missionary journey, when he eventually ends up here down in Corinth. And you can see the isthmus here dividing the Aegean and the Adriatic Sea. Various attempts had been made to dig a canal to enable shipping to sail between the Adriatic and Aegean seas, but none had succeeded in Paul's day. That goal was only finally achieved in 1923. Arrangements could be made to drag a certain types of boats overland for the 6 miles or so between the two seas, enabling ships to avoid having to sail around the southern part of Greece. Corinth had a Roman administration and architecture. Native Achaeans and immigrants were barred from holding public office. Various immigrant groups, including Jews, settled in Corinth. Corinth, as a busy port city, had a transient population, with everyone from vagabonds to philosophers who passed through. Its economy was largely dependent on services offered to travelers. Paul arrived in Corinth around AD 50 or 51 during his third missionary journey and spent 18 months there. During this time, he met Aquila, a Jew from Pontus, and his wife Priscilla. They were tent makers like Paul, who had recently come from Rome after the Jews were expelled by the Roman Emperor Claudius in AD 49. Claudius had first prohibited Jews to hold meetings in synagogues, but because this did not result in a decline in their religious and political disturbances, he expelled them from the city. Paul spent some weeks speaking in the synagogue in Corinth, but eventually was forced to leave, taking with him a mixture of Jews and a significant number of pagans who had become believers, and forming a network house of churches. In AD 51, synagogue leaders tried to bring charges against Paul, hauling him before Gallio, the Roman governor of Achaia. The Jews complained that Paul was introducing other Jews to practice an unlawful form of worship. For example, that Paul was adapting Jewish prayers to include Jesus within them. Gallio was indifferent to the matter, seeing it as a squabble within the Jewish community, and refused to render a verdict. He showed no concern even when Sosthenes, the synagogue leader and one of Paul's converts, was beaten in broad daylight. Paul remained in Corinth for a short time, but he soon departed for Ephesus on the way to Jerusalem and Antioch. After Paul left Corinth, the Corinthians were visited by Apollos, a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian and associate of Aquila and Priscilla. And maybe even they were visited by Peter passing through Corinth on his way to Rome. These visits, while good for the church in general, seem to have divided the loyalties of the congregation and generated the beginnings of a personality cult. Paul learned about all this when he arrived back in Ephesus from Syria. He subsequently wrote a letter to Corinth urging the church members not to associate with believers who engaged in sexual immoralities. He then wrote the much longer letter that we call 1 Corinthians from Ephesus in around AD 53 and sent it through one of the house church leaders who had visited him. Paul wrote in response to two things. First, he wanted to answer several questions, written questions from the Corinthians about marriage and celibacy, the eating of food sacrificed to idols in pagan temples, spiritual gifts, the collection for the needy Jerusalem church, and the prospect of the return of Apollos to Corinth. Second, he also wrote in response to disconcerting news from Apollos and several church leaders about factions, incest, lawsuits, women inappropriately dressed, disorder in worship, and particularly denials of the resurrection. Things then got worse. Timothy brought news that his instructions had not been heeded. Paul therefore made a second visit to Corinth, probably sailing straight across from Ephesus. He refers to this as a painful visit, since it was not well received. He returned to Ephesus, where, as we have seen, the situation deteriorated and ended up with him not only in prison, but in a seriously bad shape personally and physically. He then may have written what he calls a letter of tears, which had a powerful effect on the Corinthian church. After his release from prison in Ephesus, Paul traveled back to Corinth the long way by land around northern Greece, anxious through the first half of the journey about what reception he might expect. Titus, however, came from Corinth to meet Paul in Macedonia in northern Greece and reported both good news and bad news. On the good side, the Corinthians had dealt with the leading antagonist who was instigating the opposition to Paul. And on the negative side, Titus also informed Paul of the arrival of the people Paul calls the super apostles, who criticized Paul's ministry as inferior to their own. It is not clear whether Paul then wrote the whole of 2 Corinthians in Macedonia, or whether he then continued in a different vein, a letter he had begun either in Ephesus before setting out, or at some point on his journey north. The letter celebrates the Corinthians' reconciliation to him and gives instructions for a further visit from Titus to get the collection money ready, addresses the question of the super apostles, and prepares them for Paul's third visit. When 2 Corinthians, whether 2 Corinthians was a single but disjointed document or a composite document from at least 5 separate letters that had been put together, had been strenuously debated. A plausible scenario is that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians over some time while in Macedonia, or indeed on the way from Ephesus north to Troas and then across into Greece, staying in different places, elaborating his letter, always returning throughout from different angles to the defense of his calling and missionary career to bring people, Jew and Gentile, to believe in Jesus. Thank you. That was our introduction to the letters of St. Paul to the first and second letters to St. Paul to the Corinthians. And next week we'll actually begin our study of the verses of the first letter to the Corinthians. God bless you and thank you for watching.